Welcome, everybody, to the Techmeme Ride Home podcast show, The Experience. Let me try that again. Welcome, everybody, to the... It's not like I haven't done this 50 times.
Keep it all.
It's good. Welcome, everybody, to the Techmeme Ride Home Experience for April 21st, 2021. We are here today joined by at Loudmouth Julia to talk about what is going on with Netflix and the streaming wars and whatever came up in my mouth from vomiting a little bit about like what happened in their earnings report. But Julie, why don't we start with you just introducing yourself, your background. I know you've been on the show before, but for folks who are coming back to you for the first time, or I guess that doesn't make sense. But anyways, you get the idea. Say hello and yeah.
Hi, I'm Julia. I am a senior strategy analyst at Parrot Analytics, and I work with a number of clients across the OTT space, many of whom you subscribe to their platforms for. Before that, I worked at The Verge. Shout out, I see my buddy Phil Esposito in listening. And I used to work at The Verge and then at Polygon and IGN, and I was covering streaming. And so I made the transition from reporting on it to effectively consulting their strategic roadmaps on it.
So, Julia, what I wanted to start off with was that you're one of my favorite people in media. I read everything that you do, and I'm making a liar out of that by realizing that I didn't know that you had transitioned to where you are now. So, congratulations.
Thank you.
Chris, can I tee it off?
Please, dive in.
Super simple, Julia. WTF Netflix. I think maybe the easiest way into this is there's some famous quote that maybe a Peacock guy or one of them suits said a couple years ago that like it's going to be an interesting 5 years for Netflix because all of the competition was coming for them. And I mean, is that essentially bottom line what we're seeing now is just competition coming for Netflix, or is this the streaming wars are going to be more difficult for everybody than we think?
I want to start this off by saying there are two vastly different opinions on the situation, which is the street, which is Wall Street, and the investors who are saying the streaming wars have come to an end because Netflix is now valued at less than $100 billion, and they were valued at their peak, a couple of years ago at just over $300 billion. And what has happened? That is true for investors in Netflix, where, oh my goodness, we're not going to make the same amount of money that we were going to make when Netflix had a monopolization on the OTT space. That is true. The other side of it, which is where reality exists, is the streaming wars have just started. This is the exact situation that Netflix knew it was going to find itself in, albeit much worse than they thought it was going to be 3 or 4 years ago, where they said all of the clients that we work with who are licensing to us that their best content are pulling it back, and we have to invest 17, 18, 19 billion dollars in order to kind of create this type of content that we hope has the same level of demand. And demand is a term that we use at our company. Demand basically just means if there is inherent interest and love for this property, it results in additional subscriber acquisition and subscriber retention, which is the revenue model that they're built on. So if they have less demand for their shows, and we see that demand is stagnant, and we see that they're losing their catalogs, all of those licensing deals that they've made, because those companies like Disney and Paramount and NBC Universal and across the board are taking their content back, all that means is that Netflix is now in the position that we all thought they were going to be, which is this idea of like, hey, you have major competition in the entertainment space. The biggest issue with Netflix from a stock perspective is that Netflix was included in FANG, which was Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, and Google, when the idea of what Netflix was never really made sense within that category. The idea that Netflix was in there as a media conglomerate, but also a tech company, like
exactly.
An entertainment company, it never made any sense. And now Netflix is reaching the valuation. It's the correction in valuation that is where it should have been many, many years ago. And so I think what we're seeing with Netflix right now is, again, this overcorrection in the space that was going to happen regardless of it. We're still seeing a pullback effect from, a pull forward effect from the pandemic, which we are still in, but I feel like we refer to it in the past tense now. In the pandemic moment, which was 2020 and 2021, all those years did was that anyone who didn't have Netflix got Netflix, and they decided with all the new increased competition in the space, I don't know if I necessarily need this. I've got 5 or 6 other streaming services I can subscribe to. So Netflix has a tough road ahead of them in terms of competition, in terms of figuring out how to create long-term value out of the investments that they're making, how to not just think of the short-term 12 to 18 months, but how to think of a 5-year plan, how to create a flywheel effect, all of these things that its competitors have spent 50 years expertly crafting. But I'll also say this at the top of the hour, I don't bet against Netflix. I think the business revenue is still strong. The model is still strong. I think the executives are still strong. I think they're in a moment of R&D in the way that many of the NASDAQ top stocks are in a moment of R&D, and they're figuring out what the next step is. But I do think it's going to be a rough year or two minimum for Netflix going forward. So
would we have seen this if not for COVID maybe a year ago or 2 years ago? Like the earnings that we saw today, the sort of situation that they're in, we would have seen this earlier except for COVID times pulling everything forward.
Exactly. This is just competition. Like, it's so funny. We're so used to monopolization in the tech space without even realizing that we're used to monopolization in the tech space, that we're not used to how vast competition affects these companies. But what Netflix is encountering is many of these companies saying, hey, we're going to take a $200 million hit on our own revenue in order to pursue exclusivity, which we think will increase value perception for our subscribers, that they will eventually sign up for our service and stay with us month to month. And I'll give you a great example of that. Disney, in their first quarter of 2022, which is Q4 2021, the best way to think of Disney is there's always one quarter ahead. They came out and they said, we're going to take a $200 million loss on licensing, and we realized 2 weeks later they came out with a news announcement saying we're taking all of the Marvel Netflix shows, we're taking all of the American Crime Story, American Horror Story, we're pulling that to Disney Plus and Hulu as we try to figure out what we can do exclusivity wise. And those are really in-demand shows. Those are shows that we see as potential acquisition drivers, which means if you're not signed up for Disney Plus or the Disney streaming service bundle, which includes Hulu, that might get you to subscribe. But also it might lead to extra retention and engagement. And engagement is a super interesting word within the OTT space, because engagement on the one hand means, hey, people value what your service is because they're watching it over and over again. But as many of these companies lean into an advertisement supported tier, engagement is the best way to increase the ad revenue they're getting. So if Disney says we have all these shows, people are watching them over and over again, and that's great for our advertisers, they actually increase their revenue in terms of advertisement, and they can increase their general average revenue per user, which we refer to as ARPU in the industry, because they can say, well, our churn drops 2%. Like, let's say Disney Plus churn in the next 6 months is sitting at 3.5%. They can say we're actually losing less subscribers, we're gaining additional subscribers, they're staying and they're watching, and we can increase our revenue models in this way. And so I think Netflix would have encountered this regardless. The pandemic just had a very strong effect where they saw 2020 as a massive year for them, a groundbreaking, record-breaking year for them. And if we didn't have the pandemic, that would have happened over the course of 3 or 4 years. And now it's just happening kind of all at once. And so they have to come in and say, what's our next line of defense in this, colloquial streaming wars?
You sort of alluded to this obliquely, but to what degree is them having to rely primarily on their own catalog at this point? I mean, they've known this. They've always said we want to become HBO faster than HBO can become us. So, going back to House of Cards, they're trying to create their own back catalog. But I'm curious, for people that analyze the industry in a competitive sort of analysis of it, the fact that they don't have Marvel, they don't have Star Wars, they don't have, the Office and things like that anymore, and now they're basically left to their own devices. Is that having an effect, do you think, on their retention and churn and stuff like that?
Yes, and there is a multi-part answer to this question. Let's start with the very basic. The very basic answer to this question is if we look at Disney and the Marvel equation, which I think is the most obvious equation that we could look at, but it really speaks to the value of it. Disney spent $4 billion in 2009 for Marvel Entertainment, which gave them access to about 10,000 characters. Since then, at the box office alone, this does not count for any ancillary revenue, which is just as important as the box office revenue and VOD revenue and streaming revenue. They've made about $30 billion plus in streaming revenue. So they've made $26 billion in profit on that initial acquisition. It will go down as one of the best acquisitions in media and entertainment history. At the same time, if we look at Netflix and Netflix's attempt to do this, they spent about, I believe it was about $150 million. It might be a little bit less if I'm getting my numbers wrong, on Jupiter Ascending, which is based on Mark Millar's comic of the same name. Really big comic, huge fan base. The show was canceled within 3 weeks of its premiere, if I remember correctly. And that's a huge loss on Netflix's balance sheet. Netflix says we put this money into it. We expect it to have multiple seasons and possible flywheel effects. And flywheel, for anyone who's listening, is basically, if I put out this show, can I make it into a movie or a secondary show? Can I do merchandise? Can I do a video game? Can I do all these different things, at a theme park that leads to additional revenue that comes in based on this franchise? So Netflix wants to be there. And this is always my question with the Netflix executives, because you'll have people like Ted Sarandos, who's the co-CEO, say things like, we want hits, we don't want franchises, when that is just unabashedly untrue. Like, we know they want franchises because they'll talk about trying to develop a flywheel effect in the same way that Disney, NBC Universal, and Paramount really have within their own franchises, and Warner Brothers, of course. And they can't develop it. The big question with Netflix going forward is, if you're losing revenue and therefore your average revenue per user drops because people are canceling, and therefore you're bringing in less money, you don't want to raise your debt necessarily, you're hitting positive cash flow, like you're figuring out all those factors, but you have to spend $19 billion a year on content. The question is no longer what is the ceiling for content spend, which is what it used to be a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. It was, well, everyone has to spend $8 to $15 billion. The question is, how much value long term can you derive from those investments that they effectively start paying for themselves? If we think about what Marvel has become for Disney, Marvel is still a very big investment, of course, across the board, but Marvel also to an extent pays for itself in the ancillary revenue in terms of licensing those characters for video games, in terms of the park essentials that comes with it, in terms of clothing. Everything that comes from it is a really great addition. Netflix does not necessarily have that. Netflix wants to have it. And so I think this is the big question for them going forward. It is, how do you wisely spend your money while also realizing, like, hey, we're trying to be a 4-quadrant service. And from anyone listening who's maybe interested but not in entertainment, 4-quadrant literally just means, are you hitting above 25 and below 25? Are you hitting female and male? And are you hitting within all of those things? So HBO Max, for example, went from being from HBO, which tends to skew, I should say, heavily male, heavily above 25. And they said we need under 25 and we want female. HBO came out with a small show called Euphoria, became their biggest show ever, basically alongside Game of Thrones. And that was their way to say, hey, we have additional revenue coming in. We have this additional audience that we can tap into, and now we'll build upon it. Netflix is trying to be a 4-quadrant service. And in many ways they are. But what they don't have that HBO has, what they don't have that Disney has, and what they don't have that Warner has and Paramount is this ability to say we have the longevity of these franchises that we can tap into and really build on top of to increase our revenue as we try to find new originals. And the last thing I'll say on this point is that we talk about the strengths that everyone has and the weaknesses everyone has. Netflix's strength is still its originals. It still has a 42% market share when it comes to demand. Like, in terms of what people are interested in watching, it's still very much that. What Netflix has lost out on, and what is a really hard thing to get a grasp of, and it's really difficult for a new company in a new era that has less than 15 years of streaming, in their blood and original content, is the licensing, is the back catalog that they can no longer license because all those companies are taking it back for their own exclusive offer. So it's a really tough position to be in.
Yeah, for sure, everybody knew, even the people that were selling to them at the time, that Netflix was making their business on the backs of the back catalogs of these other companies. But at the same time, in recent years, I remember thinking that, them committing to spending, $20 billion a year to produce content was sort of like a bludgeon that they were using against these other companies, because it would be so long before these other companies could show a return on that investment. And now I almost feel like it's it's kind of a millstone around them. But okay, my specific question is: you said at the top that you're still confident in them, you wouldn't bet against them. But let me run down a list of things that they have done just recently that they have said that they would never do. I don't know. They said they would never crack down on password sharing. We knew they would do that inevitably, but that's one thing. Ad supported. They swore up and down they would never have ads or even a tier that included ads. They're pulling back, or they're claiming they're going to be a little bit more frugal in terms of spending on content, or at least maybe smarter about what they spend or whatever. So that gets to that bludgeon thing. But then also, the video game thing also seems to be like a Hail Mary sort of throw. So those are four things that I feel like that doesn't sound to me like a company that is confident. That sounds to me like a company that is, trying to grasp a lifeline.
Well, I think if we use the example that Ted Sarandos and Reed Hastings always used to say, which is we want to be HBO before HBO becomes us. HBO introduced ads via HBO Max before Netflix did. And I think that was a really big moment for them. I think they had a moment where HBO Max, at this point, under the regime of Jason Kyler, who recently left and is now Discovery and under the CEO of David Zaslav has taken over, Jason Kyler introduced an advertisement-supported tier and said what I basically have been saying about Netflix, which is for people who don't want ads, nothing is going to change. Like, you're going to have your ad, you're going to have the regular thing that you pay for, and nothing will go on. But if we look at the cancellation rates and the churn rates for Netflix, there's this huge churn rate between people who are 50 plus and people between the ages of 18 and 24. 18 to 24 tends to be single users. They tend to be on the basic plan, and they're willing to pay for the cheapest because it's just them, and they want to pay, like $8 a month to get the basic needs that they want. 50 plus, almost the same, except 50 plus tends to be low engagement, whereas 18 to 24 is high engagement. And so they're not really using the platform. So anytime that you bring in a price hike, that's a really complicated thing for them to deal with, because they're like, well, I don't really use this. I kind of want to maybe one or two shows that I'm interested in checking out, but a price hike, that makes things really difficult. An ad-supported tier, all it does, and this is what HBO Max figured out too, was it's going to give people maybe 3/4 of the same content, but they'll do it for half the price, and they'll be really happy with what they have because they don't mind that. And this is effectively, like, if we talk about this strategy, this is cable. Like, this is what cable figured out. It's like, you don't mind paying $150 a month because you don't mind, as a subscriber, paying top dollar for ESPN and CNN and FX or whatever it might be, and HBO that you're really happy to have. And so you get the ABC and the CBS and the NBC, and then also some other channels for ad supported, and you get all these things come in, and it works out to be a really valuable bundle. We are effectively moving back towards that. I won't say we're moving back towards cable, although there is a strong argument to be made for that. But we're moving back towards that value proposition, especially as consolidation becomes a key factor, where you're looking at, well, Discovery and Warner Media can do this because they own 3 streaming services. Disney can do this because they own 3 streaming services. So like that value proposition comes apart in a bundle, and so you're kind of like, oh, well, this makes sense. I get Hulu for free, or I get ESPN Plus for free, or I get CNN Plus, which we'll get to in a second, RIP, for free. But we'll do all these different things, and it really works out. Netflix doesn't have any of that. Netflix does not have the content that like the additional sources, like, oh, well, you're going to get sports, you're going to get this, you're going to get that. So Netflix has to come out and say, well, what can we do to keep these people from canceling, so that way we can increase? And remember, Netflix, unlike many of these other companies, does everything in USD, which all that means is that across the board around the world, Netflix pays for and values everything in US dollar. A lot of other companies will say, well, we're going to value everything in the local currency, and then we'll pay for it based on local currency. Netflix goes like, no, we're going to do it on US dollar. So if the region of the United States and Canada starts to fall, which is what has happened in the last quarter, that's a really bad effect for what the company can spend unless they take on more debt. So they're in this position where they're like, well, we need to make more money. we know that we have a huge potential loss of customers in password sharing, so we're going to crack down on that. We know
that's in conjunction, right? So what you're saying is if they can add the ad tier at a lower cost point, I don't know, $5 a month, $7 a month, or whatever. So then when they start to nudge people off of the password sharing, they have this thing to shovel them into that is maybe a little more palatable.
Exactly. And the password sharing is not going to come for the United States and Canada first. It will come for it last. The password sharing will start in Latin America, where there is massive amounts of piracy, and parts of EMEA, which is Europe and the Middle East, and parts of APAC, which is the Asian Pacific region, where the plans are a little bit cheaper because they have to be. If we could have a whole 40-minute conversation on India. Like, the reason that Netflix is not doing well in India is specifically because of the price valuation and the price valuation of cable in that country. So Netflix has to go, well, okay, if they're going to share passwords, how can we really try to bring them in as additional subscribers beyond this and really get them to subscribe and then, not cancel? And so they'll start there. Eventually, password sharing will come back to the United States and Canada, especially if Netflix is not adding the amount of subscribers that they want to add. They'll say, well, you're sharing a password, we can get another, let's say, $10 to $15 out of you. The problem with this is that Netflix, and the core issues that it always comes back to demand for content. If we look at what HBO Max and even Apple TV Plus do really well, it is those TV shows are constantly in conversation. Those movies are constantly in conversation. And so you're like, I'm going to sign up for it, and there's something every 2-3 weeks. I was listening to a Twitter Spaces with Kara Swisher and Casey Newton, and Casey said, HBO Max over the course of the pandemic, thanks to the movies, but then also the TV shows, became my go-to streaming service. And that's what Netflix has not had in a year. Like, they have not had that.
You can't get anyone to agree on anything these days. So when UBS, Deloitte, and Citi all say something, I listen. Recently, they all published reports highlighting an unexpected asset class. It has nothing to do with NFTs, Bitcoin, or anything like that. Shockingly, they all believe fine art is an investable financial asset. And you know what? I agree. In fact, I've invested in art with Masterworks, the revolutionary fintech platform. Here's why. Contemporary art prices outpaced the S&P 500 by 164% from 1995 to 2021. Citi also reported art had the lowest correlation to stocks of any major asset class. Plus, it's just cool to own a piece of some really famous art. But adding this asset class to your portfolio used to cost millions of dollars and lots of time until Masterworks changed the game. Thanks to them, you can become a bona fide art investor in minutes. If you want to join me and 340,000 other early adopters, just go to masterworks.io/ride for priority access. That's masterworks.io/ride. See you all there. See important Regulation A disclosures at masterworks.io/about/disclosure. Listen up, because I've got a great deal just for you. Yes, you. Cut your cloud bills in half with Linode's Linux virtual machines. Develop, deploy, and scale your modern applications faster and easier. Whether you're developing a personal project or managing larger workloads, you deserve simple, affordable, and accessible cloud computing solutions. Get started on Linode today with $100 in free credit, just for listeners of the Techmeme Ride Home podcast. You can find all the details at linode.com/techmeme. Linode has data centers around the world with the same simple and consistent pricing regardless of location. Choose the data center nearest to you. You'll also receive 24/7, 365 human support with no tiers or handoffs regardless of your plan size. You can choose shared and dedicated compute instances, or you could use your $100 in credit on S3-compatible object storage, managed Kubernetes, and more. If it runs on Linux, it runs on Linode. Visit linode.com/techmeme and click on the Create Free Account button to get started. That's Linode, Linode, linode.com/techmeme.
So that was going to be my next question, which is, I went down the list of the things that they said they would never do and they've done, or at least announced they're going to do in the last year. And so basically the last one remaining is the whole we release everything all at once as opposed to doling it out over the course of weeks. And listen, man, if what it is, and there's articles that I saw today that were talking about the churn and things like that. Like, if not just the churn, but like how easy it is to, they've got a great show, I'll sign up again. and then when that show ends, I'll cancel and then come back when there's another. If you dole it out 10 episodes over the course of 10 weeks, that's sort of to your benefit in a very big way. Do you think that the next domino to fall will be this whole release everything at once thing?
They're already doing it. They're already trying it with unscripted and reality series. They're already doing it with Stranger Things to an extent where they're splitting into 2 seasons, which was the Mad Men effect. And when we looked at AMC doing it with Mad Men, it felt like an Emmys play. With Netflix, it feels like a subscribers play. We're already seeing that happen, and they won't admit to that until they have concrete proof that it's really working. But of course, if the value, I mean, look at Disney Plus. So I think going forward, I should say, the minimum that we will see happen is that they will do the 3-episode release at once to get people interested, and then weekly. So you get maybe 7 weeks out of it. But 7 weeks translates into a quarter of subscribers, a quarter reduction in churn, a quarter of additional subs. That is what the street wants to see. That is enough for investors to continue giving you money to continue doing what you're doing. And so I think Netflix is already doing this. They will continue to do it. And I think what I will give Netflix credit for is that Netflix has never said we're going to grow our subscriber population by 3x, 4x the margins. I think this is a thing for Disney that's going to come back to bite them in the butt, for lack of a better word. I do think Disney is promising 3 times what they should be promising, and they're going to introduce a bunch of different ways to get subscribers in to try to meet those goals by 2024, 2025. I think what Netflix has always done extremely well is saying, we have these subscribers, we're number one, we have the content spend, we're now cash flow positive, we don't have much debt, we're trying to figure out what the next step is. The biggest, I say this all the time on Twitter, making a lot of TV is extremely simple. Making great TV is nearly impossible. There's a reason that Casey Bloys and his team at HBO are as protected as they are every time there's new acquisition. No one can make great TV like Casey Bloys and his team. And that is, why they're so protected. So I think for Netflix going forward, the question that comes out of every investment they make is, what is the longevity prospect of this? What is if we're going to invest $100 million into this, or if we're going to invest $10 million into this, what are we hoping to get out of it that will last longer than 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 weeks? Do we want to get a season 2 renewal? Do we think there's a way for us to combine this with our gaming strategy going forward? Whatever it might be, that's going to become a question that's super important to them. And the irony is that is a question that has been important to legacy media operations for years. Like, that is something they're hyper aware of. Is like, how do we take this brand that we're investing money into and really expand it, 5, 6 times what the investment is? And so Netflix is taking that point now. I think it was naive. No, I don't want to use the word naive. I think it was maybe a little bit arrogant to say we don't worry about competition because we're doing fine, when the competition that's coming in is from some of the greatest legacy media and entertainment content creators in the world, who are saying, like, we know what we do. We have the relationships to do what we do. But I've said this before, and I'll say it again. I don't bet against Netflix. I didn't bet against Netflix before. I don't bet against Netflix now. They're in an R&D moment. I think they need 3 to 4 years to show what their changes will be, because it takes 3 to 4 years for those changes to show. But it's a tough moment. I will say everyone is always decrying this as the end of the streaming wars because Netflix is not doing well. Netflix not doing well is just proof that monopolization in a capitalistic moment does not work, and that competition is great actually for the economy. And so I'm extremely excited to see what happens over the next 3 to 4 years.
Wow. That was a lot. There were so many threads that I want to pull on in what you're saying. Big one, I think, does come to this question, I suppose, related to what you use as kind of like legacy, media companies. But actually, I would think about them as kind of like, I guess, well-known franchises. And, you brought up Jupiter's Legacy, and I'm a big Millar World fan, and I read Jupiter's Legacy as a comic, and I was excited to see it actually come to Netflix. And I was like, oh, this is like so smart, because they were actually putting out Millar World comics, which they had acquired, Netflix had acquired, and they were doing the shows. And that was something that was new and a little bit different. And what I was noticing for a period during the pandemic was that Netflix seemed to be partnering and exploring different things that streaming companies hadn't really done before. obviously the comics was one thing. I'd love to hear more about your thoughts about their gaming plays, which seems very early and not really in their wheelhouse. However, lots of people are going there. And as Brian has been reporting on, platforms like Xbox and Sony looking into bringing advertising into games, and with new technologies like Unreal Engine 5 and some of the deepfake stuff that's coming, you're going to be able to have these dynamic advertising driven environments, where people can walk around like in Blade Runner and all the ads are personalized to you, and so everyone's seeing a slightly different movie, and that's very potentially interesting and lucrative. So I guess I want to bring it back to the point about competing with these platforms that have been around like slumbering giants for a long time. And now they're really getting into the streaming game. It used to be that Netflix could be just advanced from a technology and streaming, capacity. And they're like, no, we're going to get rid of the DVDs and we're going to move full on to streaming and internet delivered content. And that's going to be the future. And they've built that. And now they've trained their competition in a way to use this new distribution platform very effectively. I mean, I've been really impressed by HBO Max and what they've done. Even though the naming was confusing in the beginning, I think they've really kind of like hit their stride, and they're developing great content and so forth. So if Netflix doesn't have the kind of, Mickey Mouse style or Star Wars style or Marvel or DC franchises, what can they do? I guess I'm fixated on the Jupiter's Legacy part, because there was an opportunity to create a franchise, to rival Marvel or something along those lines, and then it didn't work out. So is it just that it's really, really hard to build up those types of long-term storylines and that type of investment in characters if you're, focused on the next thing and moving so quickly through content?
It's a beautiful question. And I think what the answer comes back to, and I was just talking about this on a podcast I host, or co-host, I should say, with Jason Snell.
Yes, please name that. And
podcast called Downstream. But I was just talking about the Harry Potter conundrum that Warner Media, now Warner Brothers Discovery, finds itself in. And this idea of like Warner, Harry Potter's a $25 billion franchise that they can't make $500 million off of anymore. Like they don't know how to monetize that adoration for Harry Potter. And there's a whole lot of things that go into it. I won't get into it now, but I think to your point, Chris, about the video game specific side of Netflix, the question I have for them, and it's a question that I'm not the only person to raise, and many people have asked this question, is if we assume that Apple, like let's just assume that Apple as a service, beyond hardware, Apple as a service, their whole thing is like, we make 80% of our revenue via ads for games and in-game monetization, and that's where we make all of our revenue. To be within a competitive gaming sphere on mobile requires you to be on iOS and Android. To be within that means be willing to give 15 to 30%. Be willing to give 15 to 30% of your revenue to Apple and Google, who are going to take that. Netflix has kind of already gone around that by saying like, well, we don't really have in-app purchases, so people come here and they come to an app. But because they have a separate app that's not within Netflix, it means that nobody's really playing it. There's not really many downloads. And so the question then becomes, well, what is to become a very successful video game publisher is one of the most complicated and one of the most notoriously difficult tasks to take on within this industry. I worked at Polygon. I worked at The Verge. Worked with many, many incredibly smart gaming reporters who would talk to me about the economics of gaming publishing. It is extremely difficult. So for Netflix to say like, well, we're going to get into the space, we're going to do mobile, and then we might be on platforms like PS4 and Xbox One, 1X or 1S, it's like, well, that's extremely difficult. You're still getting 15 to 30% of your revenue away. If the idea is to create a flywheel effect and ancillary revenue for the main franchise, if the idea is like we're going to take Stranger Things, Umbrella Academy, Jupiter Ascending back in it, like that has been successful, whatever it might be, and we turn this into a flywheel effect, maybe, but I don't understand how that necessarily generates better awareness, attention, and adoration for them. And this is the thing that comes up quite a bit. I talk about this with a lot of friends in the space. There is this very macabre, and I say macabre because the idea of monetizing love feels gross in like a very like capitalistic way, but it's true. Is this idea of like, how do you monetize adoration and love? And Marvel and DC have figured it out super well. It is like, hey, here, like we could do everything from PJs to video games, to theme park stuff, like whatever it might be, we're involved in it. We're making money off it. Netflix doesn't have many franchises where it can do that. There's maybe a handful. And even then, Netflix does not own the rights to a lot of them. If you think about the fact that like Umbrella Academy and The Witcher have actual ownership beyond Netflix, like that does not necessarily mean that Netflix is going to profit off of these moments. Bridgerton and the Shonda Rhimes, like Inventiana and the Shonda Rhimes universe, maybe there's something there. But for all the 13 years that Netflix has been involved in original content, there hasn't been much produced in terms of longevity. And I think that's the conversation that the street is actually coming to without actually labeling it. Is this idea of like, well, after 13 years, what can you show us that says you're going to start making, your money is going to start making money? Like the investment that you put in is actually going to start generating ancillary revenue, and a point that then goes back into content feeding that we can then say we're going to develop the next franchise. That does not exist with Netflix. And that's a really difficult thing to, I mean, Baja Bajaria, who is the head of content for Netflix, said this, like all of these decisions in terms of like what is a success comes down to creative output and the ability to have a really creatively engaging show. For all of the data that we have, and I love data, I sit with data all day. For all the data we have, a lot of this stuff is like a creative feeling. You know, it is Casey Bloys, again, at HBO saying like, I have a feeling Succession's going to be a big thing, or Euphoria has an audience, and taking that bet. And I think with Netflix, the issue that they have, because they're so data reliant almost, is this idea of, well, we have to hit every 4 quadrant. We have to have a show for everyone. We have to be everyone for someone, everyone for everything for someone instead of something for everyone. And that is going to come back to bite them. But when we think about what that means for the company's additional revenue going forward, it's much harder to generate a lot of adoration and love for short-term plays instead of long-term bets. And what Disney and Warner and NBC Uni and Paramount have done exceptionally well is play the long-term bet game and say, like, we think there's room here that we can derive additional revenue from these franchises that we're going to put a lot of money into over the course of the 10 years. And Netflix just seemingly isn't willing to do that right now.
I mean, it does just seem that Netflix is so much more focused on hits and on, you know, getting something up, getting it out there, and then shutting it down. Like if it doesn't get a certain amount of views in a certain amount of time. And that, I think, notoriously worked really well when there weren't a lot of competitors with good quality content that was easily streamable and accessible. But now that you actually have pretty decent choices from a number of different areas, and, you know, it's easy enough to switch. It's easy enough to cancel your subscription. It's easy enough to bounce around. I don't know that, as you said, sort of like churning through content actually will prevent churning through customers, because now they actually have a place to go.
Well, and 2 points to your exact statement right there, Chris. Mm-hmm. One, if we take the general ideology, and this is seemed to be true for the last decade in terms of how we think of OTT revenue economics, is that big talked about shows and movies, specifically movies, are your acquisition drivers for subscribers. Mm-hmm. But it is sitcoms. I would actually throw musicals into this bucket. Mm-hmm. I would throw thrillers into this. And of course, procedurals are your big retention drivers. Netflix does super well in the first part. Netflix does a really good job of having a thing every few weeks that people have to check out, whether it's a TV show or a movie. Netflix has a thing that's like, I got to watch this thing on Netflix. What Netflix does not have, and this really sucks if we think about how cable used to operate, because cable figured this out extremely well, is that Netflix goes, well, we don't have to have something every month necessarily, so you're going to lose a lot of subscribers. If we look at the recent churn rates that came from Antenna, which is a great company that does a lot of excellent analysis of kind of churn and acquisition rates for OTT services, we look at Netflix, and the biggest churn rates on Netflix are between the 18 and 24 user group and the 50-plus user group. 18 and 24 tend to be single users who are extremely aware of how to use technology and are going every month to month with their wallet. They're kind of like, oh, I want to be on Disney Plus because Moon Knight's out. Once Moon Knight's done, I'm going to go to Hulu because I want to watch Pam and Tommy. Once Pam and Tommy's done, I'm going to go to Netflix because I want to watch Inventiana. Like whatever it might be. They're hyper aware of how to control their finances with streaming. 50-plus is an interesting group because 50-plus is, again, low engagement user, or rather lower engagement user. So if they see price hikes, if there's nothing they're necessarily interested in, and that was where the back catalog really comes in, that they were getting from licensing from its partners, they're going to say, well, I'm going to cancel, especially if I can get NCIS, CSI, Law and Order, wherever on Hulu or Peacock or Paramount, whatever it might be. I'm going to go over there. That makes me happier. So what Netflix really has to aspire to is solving those two user group crises. One is an issue that cable figured out, which was, hey, if we make it really difficult to cancel, you're not going to cancel. Like it's just if you're on hold with us for 5 hours and also it's a whole thing, you're locked in. You're going to pay for the full year. The other side is how do we get that back catalog for retention? How do we get everyone's favorite show? When we think about how people sign up for OTT streaming services and which is streaming, it is not necessarily with the whole breadth of the catalog. It is, do you have 5, 10 of my favorite shows and movies that I will pay month after month after month for? I will say anecdotally, as long as Hulu has Law and Order SVU, I will pay for Hulu. Like I'm going to watch that every single night before I go to bed. And the minute it moves to Peacock, like I might cancel Hulu to go to Peacock. And so I think this is the situation that Netflix is in. It's like, not only do they not have the back catalog of procedurals that keeps people engaged, not only do they not have the adoration for shows that keeps people subscribed to Disney Plus or Paramount Plus or Apple TV Plus or whatever it might be, but Netflix is now also trying to figure out, we're spending 10 times what our competitors are spending, and we're still not reaching those same goals. So again, it's why I think like the 3 major takeaways that we have from Netflix's earnings specifically are, how do you prove long-term value derived from the investment that you're making? Or for people in this chat who are working in business, what is that ROI percentage per hit, dependent on what you are necessarily looking to achieve over a quarter per quarter basis and then year by year basis? That's 1. 2 is, how do you deal with competition who is taking back their most beloved series that they're going to have no matter what? If we look at, there's a term that we use at our company called decay rate. The decay rate just basically means let's say you had no new content within the span of a quarter for your HBO Max. If you have Friends is actually going to keep people engaged longer than you think. So it's actually a really great purchase for you to have, because the decay rate of that show is so low that it actually evens out the rest of your balance sheet. So 2,
it's like plutonium. It never loses value.
Exactly. Exactly. So if you're Netflix, you don't have any of that because you don't have shows that last past 5 seasons. You don't have any of those procedurals. What do you do invest in that point? And then 3, you have to figure out the ancillary revenue that is based entirely upon adoration of franchise. And Netflix does not have franchise beyond Stranger Things. Like, let's think about it. Netflix does not own The Witcher. Like Netflix, like that is a CD Projekt Red and a book publishing IP. Netflix does not necessarily own a lot of its other franchises, where they're partnering with gaming publishers, or they're partnering with other people.
Does that also mean, I'm thinking Witcher, like, does that also mean they don't know when the next season of Witcher will be available to them?
So they do know, because they own.
They would know, but do they have control over it?
They do. They do have control over the TV rights, but the idea of like, what is the ancillary revenue of The Witcher for a company like Disney? Like when Disney takes over a Marvel, they go, we own the TV, we own the film rights. That's great. We also own the comics, so we can do a bunch of comic stuff. We can do a bunch of books. We can do a bunch of podcasts. We can do a bunch of clothing lines. Those rights get much more messier with Netflix when they're saying, "Hey, we're going to partner with the major gaming publishers like Ubisoft and Sony to produce these works." Sony and Ubisoft are not going to give them the rights to the ancillary stuff. Like, they're not going to be like, "Hey, you get apparel, you get like additional video game stuff." Like, that's our right. We're going to give you the right to develop TV shows because it actually helps us out. When The Witcher premiered, The Witcher was great for Netflix back when it premiered in 2019 or 2020, whatever year that was. It was much better, arguably, for for CD Projekt Red, who saw massive investment in terms of people signing up to play The Witcher 3. Like, it created longevity for that franchise, for that game publisher. And so I think that's where Netflix is in this really tricky position, where Netflix does not necessarily have this ability to control the entire flywheel effect the way that Disney and Warner have structured their deals to do so. So as Netflix continues to compete against them, when they're already losing on the back catalog side, when they're already losing out on their demand for originals continues to diminish quarter after quarter, and they're trying to figure out, well, how do we compete with these guys? This is where legacy media is going to come in and say, we have the relationships, we know how to do this part of it, we're also getting into streaming, and we're going to figure that part out. And I think it's much easier for the legacy media to figure out streaming than it is for streaming media to figure out legacy.
Yeah, just on that, as you're talking, I'm just sort of thinking back to like the history and the legacy of Netflix now, and it seems like their whole model was about speed, And I remember, I worked at Uber, and Uber was all about like speed. It was about getting you from point A to point B super fast, inexpensively, cheaply, and a lot of that growth was, I think, predicated on spending a lot of VC money, money that sort of came cheap and was easy to burn. And in a way, if you think about sort of like a rocket metaphor or something, Netflix, had a huge amount of thrust behind it. It was moving super fast, and it seemed like it was, getting into what is it called when you're in space and you've hit the point where you're
escape velocity.
Thank you. Yeah, exactly. But it seems like the difference is that the slow burn, kind of more gradual, slow content in a sense that's more, everywhere, like prolific, actually is a much stronger long-term bet. And it wasn't as, sexy as kind of like the new guys coming out of Silicon Valley and disrupting Hollywood. I actually went on vacation in Disneyland, and man, to try to imagine a Disneyland type experience run by Netflix actually sounds pretty horrible. Like it sounds like the Fire Festival, like it's sort of like there and it's built and it's like fast and quick and, you're moving on to the next thing the next day, but it doesn't have, as you're saying, and I think your analysis is super interesting to think about where this goes. It doesn't have sort of a deep bench of content and of collateral and of relationships and of, like you said, pajamas that people are wearing because they love the stuff so much that they can't let it go. And whenever they, want to get their Netflix, or I'm sorry, their Marvel fix or their Disney fix, they know exactly where to go for that content. And as you're saying, Netflix just doesn't have those type of iconic shows, that are kind of a different realm or a different order. I mean, like being in the DC or the Marvel universe, like you're sort of living it. It is almost like an augmented reality before it gets to your eyeballs, because you're living in those worlds and those narratives and those stories. And I just don't think that I can observe a similar level of engagement that persists over years on the Netflix side of things.
The biggest question I get from my clients across the board is, how do we create? It's really interesting, actually, because I did a study for a client, will remain unnamed, and they're basically like, what is the future of theatricality in terms of what movies are released?
Can you just give us like a little color on that client? Is it like what do they do?
I can't give any color. A big client. I'll just say the big in the entertainment space.
I guess would they be competitive with Netflix or creating content for Netflix or something?
I would say competitive.
Okay,
and
great.
Yeah, competitive. And they were asking, what is the future of theatricality? And when I first delivered this kind of deliverable for them, I said, well, here's what Marvel does. And it was interesting because they immediately emailed back and said, we don't care about Marvel. And in the sense that, like, of course we care. Like, of course we care about what Marvel's doing, but they're such an outlier. Like, we're not going to compete with that. Like that's such a, like, well, okay, beyond that, what else can we do? And so it's really trained my thinking of how to think about a lot of this stuff, where when a lot of my clients come to me and they say, how do we develop a franchise? I actually remove, like, okay, Marvel and DC. I'm like, sure, let's remove that. Like, if we take that out, how do you create the next? And I always use this example because this show started as a procedural and became a 20-year run thing. I was like, how do you create the next CSI? How do you create the next Law and Order? Like, how do you create the next, like, oh yeah, that's a franchise. Like, it developed 7 spinoffs. Like, you give Dick, I always say to people, you give Dick Wolf a new city, he will create 60 franchises. like it's fine. Like, you give him New Orleans and he'll do something with it. And so this is the thing I have with Netflix a lot, where it is this idea of what is the value proposition that you are getting for your investment. You're spending all this money trying to create the next Star Wars. Star Wars exists. Like, if you create a weird Star Wars feeling thing or a weird Marvel feeling thing, people are going to react to that really negatively because Marvel exists and Star Wars exists. They don't need that. I think what is a really great example of how to do content investment well and how you can build franchise out of low investment situations is the Taika Waititi method, which is Taika Waititi was like, what if we just subverted this idea of genre that people know really well? What if we subverted the idea of vampire? What if we subverted the idea of pirate and subverted the idea of superhero? And we take this idea that they know because it's the most mainstream thing in the world, and we provide a really holistic, vulnerable, sweet take on it for like 1/100th of the price, and we deliver 4 times the profit. And that is what Taika Waititi, for anyone who's listening, has done considerably over and over and over again for 3 different networks. Like, it's impressive. Like, he's done that with Our Flag Means Death. He's done that with What We Do in the Shadows. He's done it with Thor. Like, that's exactly his proposition. Is this idea of like, what if we deconstruct the genre to its most humane level and then subvert it? And there's this beautiful thing where with the franchises that everyone is trying to either recreate in their own way or to exploit in their own way, what that really is just really solid character development. Now, I want to say this, easier said than done. I'm not saying like, wow, look how easy it is. Like, everyone should have a Taika Waititi. Like everyone should just figure that stuff out. But what Taika does, what Kevin Feige does at Marvel, what Walter Hamada does at DC, and what Dave Filoni does at Star Wars, is having an architect who understands what the core attribution is to all of those franchises that really makes them succeed in different formats: animation, anime, live action comedy, live action drama, whatever it is, film, television. They understand how to make a series turn into a $10 billion franchise. And that is something that Netflix, I hope, desperately invests in. I think it's much easier, again, said than done. But they need someone who can say, hey, here's what you need to do with what you actually own, and here's how we expand it into something across 10 different revenue.
But are they built for that? I mean, as you're describing this, it occurs to me that the franchise model that you're kind of talking about, actually there's kind of an analog with like restaurants and with good chefs, that go to different places and maybe do some fusion, or they have a style. What you're talking about is how you can remix content in different ways once you really have mastered the ingredients of what goes into each thing. And then you're just kind of like substituting, I'm going to not think of any spices right now, but, remixing a bunch of stuff that is familiar, that's known, but, tastes like things that people want. And I guess I just wonder if Netflix is kind of like a ghost kitchen. And so you're never going to build like that long-term brand value that when everyone comes back from the pandemic, like they want to go and they want to stay in those places because those places are known to provide a certain quality of experience that you just want to like luxuriate in. So I guess like structurally, is Netflix set up to do what you're describing?
Yeah, Chris, that's a really good point. I had someone ask me the other day, why doesn't Netflix let things run past 5 seasons, right? Mm-hmm. I remember...
Well, they cancel things after 4 weeks at this point.
Yeah, and I think I'm going to take a guess. I'm sorry for anyone who was born after like 2000, but for the majority of people in this chat, I imagine,
probably
we all remember like 5, like shows would last 5 to not 10, but 5 to like 6 seasons. And I was saying to a person who asked me, who was born after 2000, and I asked, and they said, why don't they let them run that? And I said, well, Netflix doesn't have syndication rights. Like, why would Netflix run things to syndication points where they can then make double their revenue, because they said, well, cool, we'll lend it out to TBS and lend it out to whoever, and they just run reruns of it. The idea of like Seinfeld or Friends or How I Met Your Mother or whatever, or even New Girl to an point.
Or even Veronica's Closet, or even like existing doesn't make sense from a revenue model. Like, it does not make sense to that company. So unless they can make it work within the first 5 to 6 weeks, like, it doesn't make sense. And I think, to your point, Chris, like, that is the issue that Netflix comes into, that legacy media has, where ABC, who's under Disney, of course, goes like, Modern Family is syndicated on 190 networks, like globally. Like, it doesn't matter. That's going to produce revenue for us no matter what. And then we can take that money. And I think this is the other issue that Netflix runs into that the other legacy media companies don't. But legacy media companies are always going to have stuff on broadcast, because that's still where the huge portion of their ad revenue is, a huge portion of their audience is. So they put shows out there. Those shows do decently. They syndicate half of them, and then they have all this additional revenue coming in. They take that revenue, ensure that broadcast and cable's fine, but then say, we're going to do what everyone's been doing for the last 5 years, and we're going to take all of our best content, we're going to put it on streaming. This idea, like, I was talking to my aunt. I was home in Toronto last week, and I was talking to my aunt. I said, what are you watching? And she goes, it's unfortunate. I have all these shows I want to watch, but I don't want to sign up for all these services. It's a pain in the butt.
And I said, yeah. And I said, the issue is that all these companies, even the ones who have broadcast cable channels, are putting all their best content on streaming because that's where they think they need to be. And so I said, but they have the ability to do that with low risk of overhead interest because they're getting all this revenue from the linear side. And as long as the linear side is protected, they can put all that extra revenue coming in into streaming and they can build that product up. Netflix does not have this. Netflix is licensed exactly 2 shows. One was BoJack Horseman to Comedy Central, and it was only like the last season. And I can't remember the other one. It was also a comedy. And it might have been I'd been Narcos. But Netflix basically took something and was like, hey, we're going to do this to get additional revenue. But otherwise, Netflix is entirely sub-based revenue. Like, it's entirely sub-based revenue. That's the only thing they have. So if demand for those shows drops off as it has consistently over the last 8 quarters, then that means that Netflix is in a position where it's like, well, if our sub revenue is not generating the revenue that we need to increase our investment in shows, we need to take on additional debt. We don't want to do that because then the street knocks us down and then we're under $100 billion where they are now. It's a really complicated position for them. They don't have the avenues, I should say, that the legacy media does. But I do think we're seeing this very interesting moment where if you take your y-axis and your x-axis, they're just hitting that crossover point where Netflix is kind of going like, well, we need some of what cable has, and broadcasting cable is going like, well, now we're in a position to really take on Netflix.
I've been an Alto IRA customer for a couple years now. All of my personal contributions to the Ride Home Fund come from my Alto IRA account. And when they launched an Alto Crypto IRA last year, I signed up for that as well. This has let me invest in crypto and do it in a tax-advantaged retirement account. Alto's Crypto IRA is the easy way to get crypto into an IRA. Trade all you want without the tax headache. Create an account in just a few minutes. Invest with as little as $10. There are no setup charges, no account fees, but there is secure trading 24/7 through Alto's integration with Coinbase. More than 150 coins are available, including Bitcoin, Ethereum, and Cardano. And there are multiple ways to fund your account. Make a cash contribution, transfer cash from an existing IRA, or roll over an old 401k. Ready to take your investments to the next level? Diversify like the pros and trade without tax headaches. Open an Alto Crypto IRA with as little as $10. Just go to altoira.com/techmeme. That's ALTOIRA.com/techmeme. Start investing in cryptocurrency today. Go to altoira.com/techmeme. Life insurance can give you peace of mind that if something happens to you, your loved ones would have a financial cushion for rent or mortgage payments, loans, education costs, and everyday expenses. Policy Genius is your one-stop shop to find the insurance you need at the right price. Click the link in the show notes or head over to policygenius.com and just answer a few basic questions. In minutes, you can compare personalized quotes from top companies to find your lowest price. You could save 50% or more on life insurance by comparing quotes with Policy Genius. The team of licensed experts at Policy Genius are on hand through the entire process to help you understand your options and make decisions with confidence. The Policy Genius team works for you, not the insurance companies. Whether you're just starting to shop or have questions about your active policy, they're your independent advocates offering unbiased advice. Policy Genius has options that offer coverage in as little as a week and avoid unnecessary medical exams, and they do not sell your info to third parties. Head over to policygenius.com to get your free life insurance quotes and see how much you could save. That's policygenius.com.
Julia, I want to be respectful of your time, and I really want you to comment on CNN Plus before you go. But can I squeeze one thing in here real quick? Because I've read a couple times today now references to TikTok, and I have heard now enough times from people inside Meta that the whole reason that Meta is going through its midlife crisis, well, there's tons of reasons, but is because they know the numbers better than anybody, and TikTok is basically eating everybody's lunch. I'm curious, are you seeing that in your analysis and in your numbers? Is TikTok something that is not just maybe eating Netflix's lunch, but maybe everybody's lunch in streaming right now?
I would say I get where people are coming from in terms of attention for content. Like TikTok is an increasingly interesting competitor. It's not the same, though. If we were going to talk about this in the way that people really love to get on and say, like, well, TikTok is the reason Netflix is failing, we would have seen that happen with YouTube. There are two vastly different things competing for vastly different audiences. And I will tell you that the people who are watching TikTok and YouTube are watching 8 to 9 hours of content a day. Like, they're splitting their time between the hot teen show on Netflix.
Are they paying for YouTube?
No. And they're not paying for YouTube. Like, okay. They're watching it with ads. They're happy to watch it with ads. Think about TikTok. Half of TikTok is ads at this point. I will say extremely well done. Like, very innocuous, but those are ads. That audience is on their phone and on their laptop all day, every day. Like, they're watching everything. So I think, well, it's an interesting question.
So you're saying that there was no substitution happening between increased usage of TikTok or Reels or content like that?
No, I mean, I think it's like, again, if we think about like YouTube in its heyday, and like I spent many years covering YouTube as a reporter, YouTube in its heyday was like 2012 to 2015, which was also a great moment for Netflix coming into the space, but also for cable television still. And those numbers didn't necessarily drop. Like, cable was dropping as Netflix came in, but that had less to do with YouTube as it had to do with like just the transition of how people were consuming their content. And so I think this idea of, well, TikTok exists. Well, of course it does. But I will say anecdotally, I watch TikTok in bed when I wake up in the morning. It's like the first thing I do. And then I'm at the end of the night, though, I'm watching the new Netflix, the new Hulu, the new HBO Max thing. And I think, and that is what our research says a lot of people who use TikTok and OTT services do. Like, there's more than enough hours a day. You know, when Reed Hastings used to say, we compete with sleep. Like, yes, it was arrogant. But it was this idea of like, if we think about the minutes and the hours of our days, we all watch TikTok between conference calls. Like, it's like, I have 10 minutes, I'm going to eat a sandwich and watch TikTok. But at night, when we're going to bed or when we're making dinner or when we're sitting on our couch with our loved ones or our friends or by ourselves, like, it's that moment of like, I'm going to throw on the show that everyone's talking about. There's a reason that the 9 o'clock spot is still so important to HBO and all these other networks. Like there's a reason that exists. So I think for all the pressure that that TikTok puts on competitors to create more attention-driving content, it's more so a competition between YouTube and Instagram, and it will be for many, many years, than it is with Netflix and HBO and Disney.
Interesting. I mean, one thing, and you know, to get to the CNN Plus question, you know, that YouTube does have, of course, with its creators is, you know, potentially in some ways relationships that viewers have to those creators. And of course, that moves into like the Twitch world and to even, you know, Discord to some degree, but mostly on YouTube. You've got people that you subscribe to, you follow them, and you're there for their content. Whereas again, Netflix really doesn't have that. You don't follow a certain actor or something and you see all of their stuff. You know, you kind of go for the content, for the shows, for the high production value. And so in terms of, again, thinking about the deep bench analysis, YouTube actually has that, because, you know, maybe you have built up a relationship with a YouTube star or creator over years, and so that would be one reason to keep going back there, you know, despite the ads and despite some, you know, other experience changes that again makes Netflix a little more vulnerable in terms of being able to be substituted for. Okay, so setting that aside, the CNN Plus, like, what the hell? Like, that seemed to be even worse than Quibi. And like, I just, my brain is kind of exploding. And at the same time, looking backwards, it feels like that would have been really, really hard lift to get people to want to pay for something that, you know, frankly is available for free on airport TVs. And you kind of just put it on the background and you're like, wait, what? You want me to pay for this now? Help us break this down. Yeah.
So I think I tweeted earlier today, basically, that, you know, like CNN Plus's quick closure was as much a result of conflicting, like, top-down strategic views from two executive teams, which was basically the Tyler team at Warner Media and also the David Zaslav team at Discovery. As much, though, I agree with myself. As much as it was
good. I agree with myself earlier today.
I agree with myself. But I think it was as much of a misread into the value proposition of news with an OTT service, and a misread into how consumer appetite for news and news style content changes from linear to digital. And by that, all I mean is, if we take the New York Times as an example, and I think it really is a perfect example of how the New York Times looked at its subscriber acquisitions, it is not news. It is like, we have games, we have Cooking, we have Wirecutter, we have The Athletic. And The Athletic, by means, I'm trying to say sports betting. Like, that is why they acquired that company. It is sports betting, it is local sports, because local sports and help with sports betting. It is them saying the habit for this idea of news is that you're going to get some kind of monetary value or like cultural value out of your life that you might not necessarily associate with a news subscription. But when you subscribe for that, for these reasons, you're also going to get news. CNN Plus went the opposite route. And CNN Plus said, what if we said you're going to get really niche versions of TV shows that appeal to like media Twitter and like very specific parts of the country. And also you're going to pay $6 for it. You're not going to get any actual live news, but you're going to get these different documentaries that would have been on HBO Max. The issue of CNN Plus was a question, a wrongful question, but what the value perception of news is in people's lives. Now, I want to differentiate between these two because I think it's important. The inherent value of news, everyone on this call will understand. We like news. It helps support a democratic country. Like, news is extremely important. The perceived value of news for what people actually want to pay for is much lower than that inherent value, because we live in an era of tweets, of Twitter, of Apple push notifications, and of extremely good free news websites. Like, I think I used to work at The Verge, and The Verge covers everything from science and politics and culture and technology, of course. And it was free. It was ad supported. Incredibly good reporters, like some of the best reporters in the business. You never had to pay for it. So why would you pay for the Journal? Why would you pay for Bloomberg? Why would you pay for the New York Times? Like if you were someone who was coming up, and you're 21 years old right now, there's not a good reason necessarily to subscribe to news. There is, however, a great reason to subscribe to the New York Times if you are trying to make bets on who's going to, win in the Celtics a net like series. Like, there's a great reason to subscribe if you're trying to cook for the person you're trying to impress. There's a great reason to subscribe if you're trying to find out which is the best, stove to purchase. Like, all of those things create a perceived value for that consumer on top of the inherent value of news. And so I think that's where CNN Plus failed. It was just, there was no perceived value that made it attractive. Now, I think, just to give Jason Kyler credit, I'm a big fan of Jason Kyler. I know Brian knows this. Huge. I really love what he did with HBO Max in his time at Warner Media. He always envisioned CNN Plus as a tile. So if anyone who is listening to this is outside of the United States and you have Disney Plus, the tile is basically what Star is. It is this idea of like, you click on a tile and there's this whole new world of content that is open to you because they've brought it in. CNN Plus was supposed to exist as that. You click on the CNN Plus tile and there's this whole new world of CNN. And I think that made much more sense than trying to do it as a standalone streaming subscription service. I do think you get two very different executives, one who's on his way out, one who's on his way in, both trying to kind of compete with each other. And that creates this beautiful moment of like chaos.
I mean, was there any world in which, given those dynamics, those politics, that CNN Plus had any shot whatsoever?
No, there was never a world in which CNN Plus as a standalone app made sense, ever. Unless you were able to actually, because, here's the thing. This is the joke with CNN Plus, and I don't mean that the service is a joke. I mean, like, the irony with CNN Plus and the irony with, like, an ESPN Plus is that it's actually CNN minus the ESPN Plus, ESPN minus, right? Like, you don't actually get the service and then some. You get some parts of the service. And so I think the biggest issue that...
Yeah, the Venn diagram doesn't actually work out in your favor.
Right. And if we think about, like, Peacock and Paramount Plus, which offer live news, they didn't have to compete with this idea of this insanely popular and world-renowned cable brand. Like CNBC was never going to be offered on Peacock. NBC was going to offer a version of news that you were going to get on Peacock. But I think CNBC is my favorite example to bring up, in part because David Zaslav, who's the CEO of Discovery, helped create it. Why is CNBC so important? If we think about who that consumer audience is, one, it is people who are retail investors who want to know what they're going to spend their money on. It is analysts and journalists who want to know what the next move is. And it is other executives who want to know what other executives are saying. The perceived value and the inherent value are one-to-one. And that is exactly where you want to be. CNN,
it's like visual Twitter.
Exactly. CNN to CNN Plus is not that. CNN is, I want to know what's happening in Ukraine the moment it's happening. I want to know if, knock on wood, a plane goes down. I want to know exactly what's happening. I'm going to turn to CNN. You're not going to get that on CNN Plus. What you're going to get on CNN Plus is like a very good Brian Stelter show, which I really adored, and that was great for like media nerds. You're going to get a really great Murdoch documentary series, which I loved because I love the Murdoch. Well, I don't love the Murdoch, I love the story of the Murdoch, I should say. But like, you're going to get that, and that's really exciting. But the story of the Murdochs should exist on HBO Max when they have Succession, when they have 3 series airing simultaneously that are basically about the Murdochs. Like, that should be where you put your content. So this idea that it was ever going to exist as a standalone never made sense, but it was never designed to. And I think that's what people are forgetting. It was never designed to be a standalone. You are in this moment of unfortunate turnover where one team is saying, this was what we had planned for HBO Max. One team is coming in and saying, we have this really great idea for a unified app. And then you get a lot of people who will unfortunately lose jobs in the crosshairs, where it's like they're just trying to do the best that they could do.
Right. So Occam's razor is this was politics where some team or some executive have had enough juice to be like, we're going to try this experiment. Everyone else behind the scenes was like, this isn't going to work. And as soon as it doesn't work, they've got enough rope to pull the plug, basically.
Exactly. There was no question that CNN Plus was going to be shuttered and then thrown into basically a combination of HBO Max, which would have been the documentaries, docuseries. So that would have been like Anthony Bourdain. And by the way, that back catalog and that content, opinionated news content is still the most sought after content on cable TV. Docuseries like Anthony Bourdain is still the most sought after docuseries. That content is extremely valuable to HBO Max. Like, that is beyond valuable to them, especially at the low cost that it takes to invest into it. The other content goes ad supported to CNN. They want to do some form of a live news show. They want to do some form of a news recap. That goes to the CNN app, which is an app that needs some redoing, but like it exists over there and it's fine. But the idea, it was never, ever, ever going to be a successful standalone app, because the perception of what the value of news is to someone. I saw a news story. I'll just say this. I saw a news story that said David Zaslav, and I really give him credit for this because I think it's what the country needs. Wants to go back to like straight up news journalism on CNN, and I give him credit because I think it's what the industry needs. If you give up that 9:00 slot, which used to be Chris Cuomo's, he was fired from CNN, they've lost 70% of their core demographic in that space since he's lost. If you give it up and you go back to global news, you're going to give more people to MSNBC and Fox, whichever way you want to go. Both of them are going to take on more people, because what people are tuning into at 9 p.m. on linear networks is they want an opinion. They want entertainment. They want a version of the thing that they're tuning into. They have conflated the team at CNN, that idea of what that audience is, with an audience who wants news. Those are two completely different audiences, and you can do two completely different things with it. But I think there's this idea of like a misdirection in what CNN Plus or what a CNN digital output, which is effectively protecting the longevity of CNN's future, is, compared to what the 7:00 to 11:00 CNN primetime lineup is. And I think that's going to be where they really struggle. And I'm interested to see what Chris Lake does now that he's overseeing it.
Julia, they're going to sell CNN now, right? Full stop.
I mean, I'm going to make a bid, obviously, with all my money.
I've heard. I don't think it's much of a secret that that's a possibility at this point. Okay, I want to make a quick sort of Tesla analogy, if you can believe it.
Are we going to talk Elon? I feel like
no, Chris. No, I made a vow on the show today.
It's verboten today. Yeah.
No, here's
until
the
we
Tesla
have some
analogy.
actual news.
No.
Funding secured. Whatever. It's fine.
Okay, no. Hear me out, because this makes sense, and I've heard this several times today. It's Netflix to Tesla, which is what has happened to Netflix. They were somebody that completely transformed an industry, had a decade's head start on everybody else. Everybody else figured out, caught up, and now is competitive. And multiple people today have made the analogy to Tesla, which is the same thing. That, again, like I've said a million times before, in the early 2000s when I lived in Detroit, and all the car people were like, Tesla's a joke. And now everybody's trying to be Tesla, just like everyone's trying to be Netflix. Now, Tesla had great earnings, but could the day come where Tesla is in a Netflix situation, which is everybody is doing what Tesla does. And it's not that they have the back catalogs, but they do have residual brand value. They do have, I don't know, bigger factories, bigger sales channels, things like that. That's it. I'm no one has to comment on that, but I'm pointing that out. But Chris,
I actually do have just one small comment on it. And one, I don't want this to come across, and I'm saying this in part because I do like Tesla, and in part because I don't want Elon fanboys to attack me.
We love Elon on this show. All of us do.
We do love Elon. And
it's like talking about the mafia in New York City. We love Elon.
Exactly.
I genuinely appreciate Elon. I don't think he should run Twitter, but to Chris, we'll talk about that's for a later conversation. Here's the thing. I love nothing more. I love than a competitive marketplace, and so I kind of hope. And here's what I'll say this part: like I don't want Tesla to lose its value. I'm not saying like I hope Tesla shareholders lose out on a bunch of money. Any of that. I am saying I hope that there becomes a moment in the electronic vehicle space where there is more competition, just because I think it creates better product. I think competition is what leads to better product and better economics and better value for customers. And I think right now, Tesla, to your point exactly, Brian, Tesla has this monopoly in the way that Netflix had a monopoly in 2014, 2015. And I would love to see more competition coming to the space. I think it's already happening. We saw, I can't remember which, it was a Japanese car maker. I don't think it might have been Honda. It might have been Hyundai, I can't remember which one, that they're going to invest like $2 billion into the electronic car vehicle space. Like that's what I would love to see more, because I do think it is better for consumers in the long run, even if it's worse for shareholders in the short term. And I think that's the point about Netflix I want to come back to, which is you're going to see people listening to this, a lot of doom and gloom about Netflix. And a lot of that comes from people who are investing in Netflix. Where Netflix was at in 2019, 2018, 2020, when they were a part of FANG, which never made any sense. Like that is not going to happen again. But if we think about the fact that Disney is trading at like 140, if we think about the fact that Paramount is trading at like I think it was like 120 last I checked, it might have gone up or down. Like that is where Netflix should be. As much as Netflix is a technology company with an amazing algorithm, it is also a content company and a media company, and that is where media and content companies are trading at. Like, don't take doom and gloom in the stock as a sense that Netflix's business model is failing. And I hope that when we think about Tesla, if Tesla were to come down a little bit in stock because there's extra competition, I would not take that as a negative sign that the space is going down or that the space is worse off. It just means that the people who are hoping to make $1,100 off Tesla stock are no longer making that and they're selling. But it actually is great if we have more competition. Like more competition leads to better product and leads to happier consumers and better products for consumers. And so that's kind of where I sit.
You know, just building on that, it does occur to me that one of the questions that actually we need to be, I guess, contemplating is what is Tesla? What is Netflix? Because I think the way that I would respond to Brian's, question and thought is if you are trying to turn a Tesla orange into a Ford apple, and what I mean by that is like apples to apples or oranges to oranges, like Tesla, I mean, as Elon talked about on the earnings call today, is so much more than a car maker. In fact, that's like one of the things that is incidentally part of their business model. And that is the thing that customers obviously have a connection to. But they are getting into the insurance business, which has amazing margins, especially if you're able to track everything that your drivers are doing and you know exactly what rate to give them. They're getting into the, home electrification space and solar and to energy. I mean, they're an amazing energy company. They have distribution for their superchargers. The thing he talked about today is apparently like robots are going to be a big part of Tesla's future. And they're also, I guess, investing in autonomous taxis, and that's going to be enormously transformational. And these are all
Elon's always going to say a lot of things, but I love Elon. I love him. I'm
sure the high is still left over from yesterday, but my point is more about what is Netflix going forward. We're about to enter into a world where augmented reality and, glasses are fixated on people's faces. Presumably, if the experience is right. We know that Facebook or Meta has bet the farm there. We know that Snap talked a lot about augmented reality experiences. So Netflix strikes me as a company that was bringing the internet to kind of two-dimensional moving pictures, and they don't seem to have a lot of immersive, content experiences yet that suggest that in the next 10 to 15 years, I'm going to be subscribing to Netflix in my Meta Quest or whatever, Apple goggles might be. So given, we're in this interesting moment post-pandemic, where maybe there's some correction going on in the market. Where do you think Netflix goes if they don't build these long-term kind of metaversian environments that have these long-running narratives that people can move in and out of in these immersive spaces? Or I suppose these new mediums don't have to replace the current mediums, but it does give me, I guess, some pause or question about how much Netflix and the Netflix model will be aligned with where content seems to want to go.
I think that's the question. I think you hit the nail on the head. That is exactly it. It is, if Netflix does not get into a place where it is creating the type of longevity within its own franchises and content that it can then rest on or continue to build on, it's in a big predicament. I will say, I think one of the things I think about all the time is in 2003, Michael Eisner, who was the then CEO of Disney, passed on Marvel because he said it's too out of the box for us, right? Like doesn't make good sense for Disney brand. You fast forward to 2009, and Kevin Mayer, who was the chief strategy officer of Disney, with Bob Iger, who is obviously arguably the most famous CEO of Disney, said, I think we can make Marvel work for us. We're going to bring this kid, Kevin Feige, in, and he's going to oversee it all. And that's a $30 billion profit on a $4 billion investment so far at the box office alone. Like, that's just box office. I think that's where Netflix is at. Netflix has to figure out what is the strong bet that we make that we think will derive long-term valuation out of the investment that we make, and not just in terms of content. Like, if we think about what Marvel has done for Disney beyond content, it is beyond TV and film content. It is the idea that they are licensing those characters to Fortnite, and Fortnite played a huge part for them. It is the idea that with the Star Wars acquisition, they're going to EA and they're going to I forget the other video game publisher, but they're going to not 343, it's the other one, and they're the Titanfall developers, and they're going to them and they're saying, like, we're going to give you guys these characters and you can use them. You're going to build our Star Wars universe on the gaming side. We don't want to do that. We don't think we can do that, but we're going to license it out to you. And Netflix doesn't have that. And again, like, it's easy to sit here and say, like, oh, I think I tweeted this today of the Netflix earnings. And it's so easy to sit here and say, do better content or make franchises. Like, it's extremely difficult to do. There was a beautiful moment at Disney where Kevin Mayer, Bob Iger, Kevin Feige, Dave Filoni, Kathleen Kennedy, a bunch of people existed at the same time, and they all had the same rough ideas, and it worked out super well for them. Alan Bergman, Alan Horn, like it just worked out. Like they figured it out. That does not happen that often. It is rare that happens. And so, like, Netflix is in a point where Netflix is trying to figure out who's the best team to oversee this. Who is the best team that we bring on to develop this? Do we buy production companies? Do we go exclusive on the production companies that we acquire? Do we do more showrunners exclusivity? I think that's the wrong move. I don't think they should do more showrunner exclusivity. But it's this position where they have to really start saying, what do we invest in that is going to be high ROI beyond unscripted and reality? Because we know that unscripted docuseries and reality is going to be high ROI because the investment is so low. But on the sci-fi, action, adventure, drama side, where is the investment that you're going to create, that you're going to put in order to create a franchise? And on the comedy side, where is the investment that you're going to give them 7 to 10 seasons to produce an actual franchise and a longevity franchise that people will come back to and say, this is my favorite show. I want to watch this over and over again. Netflix does not have a Friends, Seinfeld, How I Met Your Mother, 30 Rock, or New Girl. Like, they do not have any of those types of series. They don't have a Family Matters. They don't have any of those types of shows. And they need one. They need one show to stay, because the correlation between why people sign up for cable and why people sign up for an OTT service is so psychologically different. People sign up for cable because they want access to a bunch of different things. 99% of the time it's sports and news, and then they happen to have a bunch of content on there as well. Why people sign up for an OTT service and why they keep signed up is because they have access to their favorite show or franchise, and that's it. People will pay month after month if they have access to one show. It's one show that makes or breaks many times. And Netflix does not have the one show. Like, they lost the one show. They have Seinfeld, which is great, but they lost Friends, they lost The Office, they lost a bunch of other shows, and they don't have one that's like, well, I need to have this because I watch it every single night. Where Paramount and Peacock will end up thriving in the next 2 to 4 years, this is my prediction, is that they will have 9 times the shows that that exact caliber. Where it's like, I want Criminal Minds, I want Law & Order, I want CSI, I want whatever it might be. They have it. I want Friends. Like, they will have those shows. That's where it will exist. And so, like, for Netflix, what is the move going forward? It is thinking longevity and not just short-term play, and that is disappointing Wall Street. And I say this because what the street thinks and what a solid business plan are often two different things. And I hope that Netflix leans into the solid business plan as opposed to keeping Wall Street happy.
Got it.
Wealthfront wants you to think long-term with your money. That's why they asked me to read this ad as if I'm talking to you from the distant future. It's pretty weird here in 2062. The president is an NFT, skinny jeans are back in style, and sunscreen is our form of currency now. Luckily for you, you invested your money early in an automated Wealthfront portfolio. Wealthfront's globally diversified portfolios automatically optimize to hit the goals you set and the risk level you choose, and also to get you automatic tax breaks that can boost your returns even when the market dips. It's called tax loss harvesting, and they actually invented the software. Look it up. You can also personalize your portfolio with a selection of funds handpicked by Wealthfront's financial experts. Categories include social responsibility, clean energy, cannabis, and cryptocurrency. Wealthfront is trusted with over $27 billion in assets, helping nearly 500,000 people build their wealth, and Investopedia just named them their best robo-advisor for 2022, which is pretty amazing considering the year isn't even halfway over yet. To start building your wealth and get your first $5,000 managed for free for life, go to wealthfront.com/techmeme. That's WEALTHFRONT.com/techmeme to start building your wealth. Go to wealthfront.com/techmeme to get started today. I used Grammarly to write the show today, as I do every day, because I feel like, especially lately where I have to summarize a dozen different stories into just one segment, Grammarly has been a big boost, helping me outline everything coherently. Grammarly is more than a spelling and grammar checker. It's an all-in-one writing tool that allows you to clearly and effectively communicate your ideas. Grammarly actually sharpens your communication skills the more you use it. Grammarly rewrites hard-to-read sentences more clearly. Grammarly Premium's full-sentence rewrites help you effectively convey your ideas and avoid miscommunication. It cuts unnecessary words and jargon to make your sentences easy to follow. Grammarly Premium's clarity suggestions simplify sentences and get your point across faster. And remember, Grammarly works wherever you work, in whatever app you're using today to communicate with other people for your job, like your email. Get through those emails and your work quicker by keeping it concise, confident, and effective with Grammarly. Go to grammarly.com/techmeme to sign up for a free account. And when you're ready to upgrade to Grammarly Premium, get 20% off for being my listener. That's 20% off at grammarly.com/techmeme.
Thank you for that. Brian has a slightly different topic from a very different medium that he would like to bring up.
This is the end, but I just wanted to bring up 2 books because I occasionally do that on the show. But the first one, I'm glad Julie is here because Julie might already have gotten through it, but it's Binge Times Inside Hollywood's Furious $1 billion battle to take down Netflix. I think it came out on Tuesday, but I'm already in, I think, 4 chapters in.
Is that Dawn's book?
It's Dawn, however you pronounce her last name, and Date Hayes. Yes.
Yeah.
So basically, it's telling the story of the last decade and getting to the streaming wars. So so far so good. I highly recommend that. And then the other one, germane to our interests, it came out in February. It's called The Founders, the story of PayPal and the entrepreneurs who shaped Silicon Valley. And I'm recommending this one not only because Jimmy Sonny's a friend. He did a book about Claude Shannon and the whole idea of information science. But when I wrote my book, one of the big missing pieces was the PayPal story, because there have been books on PayPal, but they were all sort of by insiders who had their own axes to grind. So it's not about the PayPal mafia. It's literally because of the PayPal mafia. It goes back and tells the story of PayPal itself, which is one of the most insane company stories ever. I mean, people don't know the fact that friggin' Peter Thiel led a boardroom coup to kick out Elon Musk as CEO, right? So
this goes way back.
The PayPal mafia story, like, as someone who listens to the All In podcast, like, it's just truly, like, it's just like, it comes up all the time.
Well, so, I mean, all of the people in the mafia show up in this book. Everybody participated. Musk, Thiel, everybody, Reid Hoffman.
Give me the book name again.
It's called The Founders, The Story of PayPal and the Entrepreneurs Who Shaped Silicon Valley by Jimmy Sonny. And I'm 2 chapters into that.
I will share a link.
Yes. And I'll try to put them in the show notes as well. Listen, we're going to wrap. Julia, I'm so thankful that you gave us so much of your time.
Yes,
I want you to plug whatever you want, but I also want to put a plug in there for, Julia is an insanely good analyst in this stuff. So anybody listening that could use analysis in this space, get in touch with Julia and her company. But Julia, tell us anything you want to tell us.
I would actually just love to plug a few analysts and very smart people I follow. I follow Andrew Agave, who used to be at Viacom, and now he's on his own. Matthew Ball, who many people who listen to this would know, who I love. Matt, good friend of mine. Casey Moore, who's one of the most underappreciated Netflix analysts in the space. Entertainment strategy guy is what his name is on Twitter. He's one of the smartest people in the world. Lucas Shaw, great journalist who I listen to and read all the time. Joe Flynn, who I read all the time. I only learn from the people that I read, and those are just some of the names. And I will say this because I'm a woman in the space, and I want more women in the space. And then the men I all listed are incredibly smart, but they're all men, who I love dearly, but they're all men. And I just, if anyone is who identifies as a woman or whatever is interested in learning more about the space, please DM me. We need more women in the space, and especially more women of color. And I would just say Twitter, despite Elon making a tender bid for it, is a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful space in that I have gotten many of my career opportunities through it. I've met many great people like Chris and Brian through it, and many of the people I just listed. So I would love to just connect more. Please feel free to reach out. My DMs are open. And that's it. I'm just so grateful to be asked to be on it, guys. Thank you so much.
You're just towing up to the line of breaking our promise not to talk about Elon on Twitter. But, listen, I am not blowing smoke. I say on the show, lots of people are the best, but Julia literally is the best in this space. And so I'm not blowing smoke at all. I can't say it highly enough. Follow Julia, whatever she does, whatever she writes. What's the podcast again? Downstream
Podcast with Jason Snell, who Apple fans will know. Exactly. Jason gives me good tech advice, and I say my mic won't work, and he say, "Have you updated?" And I said, "I refuse to do that on my devices," and it always goes well. But he's great. So we do that podcast. It airs every 2 weeks. It's a fun time.
All right, Chris, bring us home.
Awesome. Well, once again, thank you everybody for your attention today. Julia, thank you so much for spending so much time with us and so much of your knowledge and wisdom. I learned a lot and had a great time having this conversation. So thanks for showing up, and we will probably be here back again next week on Thursday. Thanks, everybody.
If your trash can is getting more miles than your car, you could pay less for auto insurance with USAA. USAA. What you're made of, we're made for. Get a quote today. Restrictions apply.